Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Almost made it to morning anyways. It's a little afternoon. Welcome to our webinar. We have been, since the economy started turning south in like 2002, 2003, doing these analyses of the governor's budget recommendations, and this continues a long history of doing that. I'm Eric Lufer. I'm the president of the Citizens Research Council, and I'm here to welcome you and kick off the show, and then get out of the way and let our experts take over. This webinar is brought to you by the Citizens Research Council, and if you don't know us yet, I hope you spend some time to learn about us. We are now a 110-year-old organization created with the idea that better government results from better information. So we don't set out to grow government or shrink government or really apply any sort of political lens to it, but just to find the good information so policymakers, business leaders, citizens, media have information to understand what's going on. We're a statewide organization. We're very nonpartisan and independent with all of our research. And we're a not-for-profit organization. That means we can only do things like analyze the budget and share it with you with the support of people like you that tune in, your businesses that you're working for, different organizations. So if you get value out of this, if you get value out of the things that we're publishing, please think about how you might be able to help us. It all helps at any amount, but obviously getting businesses and others to support would be very helpful. Let's move to the next slide. You found out about the webinar through our emails, through the MERS sharing. If you haven't been on the webinars page, you can go to our website, crcmich.org, and then you'll see a link for webinars, and the first one there is the listing for this, and you can download the slides that we're going to go through. Some people like to have those on hand to scribble notes and follow along, and this is how you can get to those slides. Next slide. Real quick introduction of our presenters. Bob Schneider is going to cover the economic outlook and talk about the general fund. Bob is in our second stint with us. He's a state budget expert, having worked with the state budget office, with the House Fiscal Agency. You can see his areas of expertise in human services, corrections, transportation. And then our Craig Thiel is going to cover the school aid fund, the universities, community colleges, everything going on in that area. Craig's also technically in a second stint, but he's a long tenure with us. Also worked in the House and Senate fiscal agencies and a short stint with the Michigan Department of State. So I don't need to hog up your time. We welcome everyone. This is being recorded. It'll be available on our website shortly after the budget presentation's completed, and you'll be asked at the end, within a day or two, for your feedback, and that's welcome. We're not going to take any questions as part of this. Mentioned MERS, we have Kyle and John following along, and towards the end of our time, we're going to turn it over to them for follow-up questions and clarification. And if you do have any questions that don't get answered as part of that, send an email and we will get back to you as soon as we can. You can find our email addresses on our website. So Bob, let me turn it over to you and take it away.
Thank you very much, Eric. And again, welcome everyone. Glad to have you with us this afternoon as we kick off our annual budget webinar outlining the governor's budget proposals that were released 2 weeks back. We're going to start today, as we typically do, looking at the situation facing the governor, the revenue situation. Many of you are probably aware, in January, state economists got together to take another look at state revenue projections from our two major funds, our general fund and our school aid fund. And at least for the general fund, the news was bad. What was already looking to be a tight budget got a little tighter. So we're going to start out with those January estimates for the general fund, and you'll see that blue bar is on top is the estimates from last May. The beige bar on the bottom, the arrows are pointing to, are the new estimates, and you see in fiscal year 26, general fund projections are down almost $1 billion, and it got a little worse. 1.3 billion in fiscal year 27 and 1.4 billion in fiscal year 28. We're going to see in just a moment, much of those adjustments we knew were coming. They're mainly tied to some tax policy changes that were made in October as we wrapped up the fiscal year 2026 budget, including the roads plan and some coupling with HR 1, the Big Beautiful Bill Act. But you see in particular one thing that's notable. Not only are the budget forecasts downgraded, but you see actual general fund revenue will continue to shrink from fiscal year 26 to fiscal year 27. That's largely due to the annualization of remember in October, we eliminated the sales tax on fuel and converted that to an increase in the motor fuels tax. But that took effect January 1st. And so only 3/4 of a year of that sales tax elimination impacted fiscal year 26. In fiscal year 27, we'll have the whole year, and that takes away some additional general fund, both directly and through a hold harmless with the school aid fund. So general fund revenue actually declines overall between 26 and 27. That's going to be a major driver in this budget. In making things much tighter, and we'll see how the governor addressed that very shortly here. Growth eventually returns in fiscal year 28, but again, we're starting from a little bit of the whole, and notice general fund in 28 is basically kind of back to where it was in dollar terms in fiscal year 25. Again, as I noted, this looks at the composition of those decreases you saw on the last page. The teal bars here are what we knew was coming. It's the result of eliminating the sales tax on fuel. That directly hits the general fund. The school aid fund was held harmless. That hits the general fund because general fund revenue is moved over to make sure the school aid fund does not take a hit from that elimination of the sales tax on fuel. There's also larger earmarks from the corporate income tax over time to the roads, and all of that is reflected in those teal portions, which means in October we knew a lot of this was coming. The beige portions, though, are the new stuff. These are new based on economics, based on revenue trends. As the economists relooked at the numbers, they saw revenue shrinking even a little faster beyond what we knew was coming last January. So that made things a little worse. The governor then also released her executive recommendation a couple weeks ago, and there's some additional tax policy proposals in that will also affect those general fund forecasts. And these now go beyond what was projected in the CREC meeting in January. These are new tax policy proposals. It includes, we'll talk about the three of them here, basically a restoration of some special treatment of seniors under the homestead property tax credit, which comes out of income tax revenue. In 2012, we made some changes to the homestead credit that capped it, and then it essentially phased down the eligible credit for seniors as their incomes got higher. Basically, the governor's proposal, as we understand it right now, and legislation will obviously be coming, basically goes back to the pre-2012 homestead credit, where there's more favorable treatment of seniors with the credit without that phase out and without that cap. That's expected to reduce general fund revenue by $90 to $100 million per year in the coming years. In addition, there's a back-to-school sales tax holiday proposed that exempts from the 6% sales tax certain back-to-school items, clothing items that with individual items that are under $100, school supply items for each item under $20, computers for personal use that are under $1,000. That policy change is expected to reduce GF revenue by about $14 million annually. And again, that sales tax holiday is scheduled for the third weekend of August. And that would be permanent as long as, if this became law, it would be each August and would come back each year on an annual basis. Then finally, landfill tipping fees. The governor, this has been proposed before. The governor, once again, will raise the surcharge on landfill waste disposal up to $5 per ton. That fee increase is expected to generate about $80 million that would be dedicated to the Renew Michigan Fund, which does different cleanup and waste management activities come out of that fund. The proposal would also relieve a GF contribution from the income tax of about $69 million that's currently in place annually. That would go away and be replaced if this proposal is approved by the landfill tipping fees. So we talked about CREC. Now there's some new things on top of CREC here that will affect GF revenue. So how does all this look now in terms of room in the budget for growth? And the news isn't good for the general fund. So the beige line here is basically those adjusted revenue estimates, the CREC estimates, adjusted for those tax proposals, adjusted for some other revenue adjustments. We have a research and development tax credit, for instance. We roll that out of these numbers, the correct numbers as well, because that's not baked into the correct numbers. So this is basically revenue estimates adjusted for different tax policy changes that have happened recently. And then that red dotted line is basically, it's just over $14.1 billion. It's the ongoing general fund appropriations that were passed last October. So what we would expect to carry into the fiscal year 27 budget. Just as a note, that number won't match up exactly with what you see in the budget bill, because we also have to include statutory revenue sharing in that item as well. That's not appropriated as general fund, but it comes out of the general fund revenues. If you look at that 100, you see a gap in 27. Before we add a nickel for anything, we're about $161 million in the hole. Just carrying forward what we already appropriated last year exceeds our revenue, available revenue, ongoing revenue by $161 million. And it's important to note, this leaves out a lot of stuff that we're going to see in just a moment. Every year we have new general fund obligations for state employee compensation costs, for Department of Health and Human Services, social service caseloads, Medicaid, social welfare programs, child care subsidies in the Department of Ed. Those generally add some additional costs to the general fund, and none of those are even factored in yet. We're going to visit those costs when we get to the governor's general fund budget proposals. So general fund, we start out in a hole, and as we'll see, there are other cost drivers that make that hole worse. The opposite is true for the school aid fund. The school aid fund did have some upgrades to revenue projections, not huge, maybe 1.5% to 2% in fiscal year 25, 26, 27. You see the 26 revenue estimate was adjusted up by just over $200 million, $170 million in fiscal year 27. So good news, upward growth in those revenue projections for school aid. And if we replicate that slide we did for the general fund, we see much better news then in terms of what this means for the governor's ability to tap school aid fund revenue for new investments. Again, just as before, that beige line is the current revenue estimates from January. That dotted blue line is what do we need to carry in the school aid fund appropriations from the budget passed last October, and you see there's a positive gap, a surplus of about $645 million. That's room for almost 3.5% growth in ongoing school aid fund appropriations. And as we'll see, the governor taps into the bulk of that in her proposal. So with that background on revenues, let's turn to the big picture of the executive budget proposal. Then I'm going to move into some specifics with the general fund budget before I turn it over to my colleague Craig Thiel on the school aid side. So this is just a summary of changes: overall budget, general fund, general purpose budget, school aid fund budget. Again, those are the two primary revenue funds for the state and probably make up 95+% of budget deliberation decision making each year. First, just a note on the adjusted gross appropriations. If you looked at maybe some of the budget books and things, this budget looks like it maybe went up by $11 billion. And that is because, and this is an issue we addressed back in October as well, last year's budget moved over $9 billion in what are generally dollar appropriations into boilerplate. It's appropriation authority tied to some Medicaid provider taxes, our hospital provider tax, our insurance provider assessment. That got moved out of the dollar part of the budget into the boilerplate authorization. The governor is proposing moving it back. So the $86.7 billion that she's proposing as her total adjusted gross budget includes that $9.3 billion again. So to make a fair comparison, we really need to include it back in 26 as well, because it's in the 26 budget too. It's just doesn't show up in the numbers. If you do that, you see about $2.8 billion in total budget growth. That's a little over 3%. That is inflation plus a little bit, right? A little faster than what inflation projections currently are. But not an $11 billion growth in the budget. So an apples to apples comparison is better reflected here. You'll see, as we talked about, the stresses on the general fund, we do see a reduction in general fund appropriations by just over $500 million. 3.6% reduction in general fund authorization. But again, kind of like last year, most of that is is a reduction in one-time authority provided in the budget. In the budget passed last October, we had $527 million in one-time authority. This year, much less, $138 million for one-time needs that are appropriated on a one-time basis. The ongoing general fund budget didn't go down much, a little, almost 1%, but a much smaller reduction there. On the school aid fund, where there was room for growth, we saw growth. So a little over $600 million in overall appropriation increases from the school aid fund. Most of that was in ongoing appropriations. The one-time appropriations down just slightly. So overall budget, inflation plus a little bit, general fund down, mostly out of the one-time appropriations, school aid fund up, given that revenue availability that we showed as we went through the revenue outlook. So now let's turn to the general fund budget. We saw as we went through the revenue highlights, we were going to start out on a hole. And the major question then that we wait to see in the governor's budget recommendation is, on top of that hole that's going to exist before we spend even a dime of any new money, what else, what other budget adjustments are necessary just to keep current programming in place? And generally, we call those current services baseline adjustments. So on this slide, we're going to look at what are those baseline adjustments that we need to make to address inflationary type increases in the budget. Then we'll look at some savings proposals that the governor has included as well. Most of these baseline adjustments are social services programming. Health and Human Services caseload costs, Medicaid is the lion's share of that. $486 million in GF growth. On top, we said 160 million gap already. Now we added 486 million to that. 40 million in child care subsidy costs that are in the lifelong education, advancement and potential department's budget. We have to pay state employees their 3% contractual raise. $79 million in general fund is needed for that. It's about half of that overall cost increase. Then in other areas of the budget, there's about 116 million spread across different departments. That's $721 million in general fund cost pressures related to just adjusting the budget to keep current programming in place. The governor did propose some savings to help try to offset some of those costs. A major one that you're going to hear more about from Craig Thiel, the use of the school aid fund to displace general fund within the higher education budget, the public universities budget, essentially almost a $200 million general fund savings by moving additional school aid fund to displace that general fund need in the university's budget. The governor also is recommending $150 million in Medicaid efficiency savings. Those have not been identified yet. There will be a work group process to try to identify mechanisms and processes and that could be put in place to save some Medicaid costs in that very large state program. Also some adjustments to the tuition incentive program that's expected to generate about $17 million in savings. So over $700 million in upward cost pressures, somewhat offset with $365 million in cost savings proposed by the governor there. There were other increases, however, in the budget that go beyond, that are new investments that go beyond these baseline current services adjustments. Some of those are related to HR1, or what many of us know as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act at the federal level. Those have imposed some additional costs on the state, both directly and indirectly through administrative pressures. Here we talk about a few of them at the top. In DHHS, the HR1 imposed additional state cost sharing for supplemental nutrition assistance program administrative costs. Generally, these have been split 50-50 between the state and the federal government. HR1 said no, the states are going to need to take on 75% of those costs. The federal government share would drop to 25%. That's about a $94 million general fund hit for that change. There's also significant staffing and other contracting related to Medicaid work requirements and eligibility redetermination requirements tied to HR1. Those come to about 589 new staff, plus some other oversight and outreach efforts, $65 million in general fund in the DHHS budget. Then if we shift over to the Department of Labor and Economic and Opportunity budget, some Michigan Works related costs and apprenticeship costs to support compliance with work requirements that come to $30 million in general fund. So on the cost side, about $189 million in new general fund costs responding to HR1. Those will be offset to some degree by some assumed savings. SNAP caseload reductions that tie to work requirements are expected to reduce total SNAP benefit costs, but those are all federal, so no general fund impact. There are expected to be some Medicaid reductions, though, tied to work requirements, the eligibility redetermination requirements, some changes to the insurance provider assessment. In fiscal year 27, those savings are on the general fund side expected to be about $70 million. But again, the net impact here is some additional general fund costs for the state related to the Big Beautiful Bill Act. And then on top of that, some new proposals. In terms of new investments, they're very focused on the Department of Health and Human Services, some additional funding for direct care workers to not only retain a wage add-on that was initially funded with some federal relief money, but also incorporating state minimum wage increases and providing for sick leave benefits for direct care workers. The general fund price tag on that is $119 million. $65 million in general fund for a new state psychiatric hospital and the operations of that. That's a permanent investment. And then some smaller ones. In all, about $187 million in general fund ongoing investments in the DHHS budget. On top of that, some one-time appropriations in DHHS. The last round of payments to the federal government for some disallowed psychiatric hospital payments in the past. Some opioid settlement money, some new funds for to help with nursing facility staffing levels, some broader money for state psychiatric hospital system beyond the new hospital and other one-time investments. $66 million in general fund is the total for those investments. So there are some other investments, but they're relatively small compared to these DHHS investments. So again, we said there's already an imbalance even before we spend any money. We've shown significant baseline adjustments, just their inflation with worker pay and in caseloads. We've shown significant new investments within DHHS and some related to HR1. How do we pay? We can't. Now we need to pay for those. We either need to find new revenue or cut somewhere in the budget. And the governor's proposal largely relies on a flow of new revenue. And here are the major pay-fors for the spending that we just talked about. The first one is a withdrawal from the state's rainy day fund, or our budget stabilization fund. Governor's recommending a $400 million withdrawal in fiscal year 2026. That shows up then. This chart here shows what is our total rainy day, and we also have a separate school aid stabilization fund in the kind of gold bars. What level of coverage do our rainy day reserves provide from both those sources? And you see, with the governor's proposal, we'd reached about 8%, likely at the end of fiscal year 25 once books are closed. This probably draws us down to hovering maybe a little over 7%. So it will have an impact on our preparedness to withstand the next recession. I should note there's been discussion of the statutory provision during the budget presentation. It was noted in fiscal year 2026, real personal income admission is expected to drop. That triggers in statute a statutory authorization to withdraw money from the budget stabilization fund of up to 25% of those reserves. When the budget was presented, that amount that would have been authorized was well over $500 million. The governor and the state budget office explained, we're not going to take the full amount. We're going to take $400 million out. It should be noted that that reduction in real personal income that triggered that that finding and that authorization is an estimate right now. And in fact, the real the real personal income only drops by 0.1%. So if inflation's if in reality inflation's a little lower than we thought, maybe in fiscal year 26, or personal income's a little bit higher, that could actually turn it positive. But right now, the projections are that it will dip below that and turn negative, which triggers the statutory payout provision. That is still, though, within the legislature's discretion. It's not mandatory. Legislature and the governor can decide how they want to deal with that. Then secondly, the next primary pay for are a series of tax proposals that the governor has put forward, generally to support the Medicaid program. Here we list 6 different tax increase proposals that the governor has outlined in her executive budget. An increase from $2 to $3 in the per pack cigarette tax, as well as an increase in other non-cigarette products, pipe tobacco, smokeless tobacco. The excise tax would go from 32 to 57% of the wholesale price on those taxes. A new vape tax, also 50% of the wholesale price. A new digital advertising tax, which would be a 4.7% excise tax on the Michigan share of any digital advertising revenue generated by large digital companies. An increase in internet gaming tax. This is expected to affect 4 of Michigan's largest internet gaming licensees. It would increase the highest marginal rate from 28 to 36% once for casinos that grossed more than $185 million in revenue. A new tax, 25-cent per sports bet tax on the first $20 million of wagers annually for each sports betting licensee, and also an elimination of the free play deduction, where an online casino, sports betting casino is allowed to write off from the tax any free bet provisions that they give to any of their users. All of that comes to over $805 million. The great majority of that goes to offset GFGP costs in Medicaid. So again, the new taxes displace general fund costs, and that helps afford the different cost increases we went through at the beginning of our general fund segment. So before I turn it over to Craig and we get into the school aid fund side of the budget, I did want to quickly visit the roads, because most of what's happened with the roads has already happened. The major road funding proposal that was approved back in October. The 27 budget recommendation lets us kind of get our first look at what that has meant for some of the major components of road funding. And what we did here was, okay, let's go back and look at the fiscal year 2025 appropriations for some of these major program areas and compare them to fiscal year 2027, which will contain the fully phased in marijuana tax, fully phased in sales tax adjustments, the motor fuel tax adjustments will be in place. So you see for local road agencies, you have about over a 50% increase in road funding in fiscal year 27 compared to the pre-roads plan 25 appropriations. For the state trunk line fund, again, a spike in state trunk line revenue that flows through mainly to road and bridge programs. Highway maintenance is kind of the first the department says, okay, well, we need to do maintenance, and then how much do we have left over to do other types of more robust repair and reworking. That amount has jumped significantly because most of it flows into those road and bridge programs. And then there was, discussion of, okay, so what does this do for public transportation? We have a comprehensive transportation fund that finances our public transit and public transportation programs. The biggest piece of that is local bus operating for local bus programs. And you'll see not quite as large as the local road agencies, but almost a 40% increase in funds that will end up passing through to them. The comprehensive transportation fund lost some revenue from the sales tax elimination on fuel, but gained more from the resulting fuel tax increase, which they receive a dedicated portion of. So local road agencies, 50+% increase. Local bus operating almost 40%, and state trunk line programs will get a boost as well. So there's just a quick snapshot of what this means once stuff is kind of phased in. There'll be a continued phase in of some of the corporate income tax earmarks, but this takes care of the bulk of the roads package, and you see the impacts there. So with that, that's a quick review of the general fund budget. I am going to shoot it over to my colleague Craig Thiel and let him talk about education budget highlights. Craig, over to you.
Thanks, Bob. From roads to schools, kind of a seamless transition right there. Good job. I'll just remind folks that the way the Michigan budget is set up is there's two omnibus budgets. The first one is kind of the general fund budget that Bob talked about. It has your programs that are funded from the general fund, as well as the transportation program is in that budget. And then we have a separate education budget, and that includes all the state spending for K-12 schools, early childhood programs, community colleges, four-year publics, as well as financial aid for post-secondary. So I'm going to try to hit the highlights of those components in the next 10 or so slides. But before I get into the details, I guess just to provide some context background as the governor presents her 8th and final state budget. K-12 students are struggling right now, both in the classroom and outside the classroom. We've seen student achievement on kind of a steady downward trajectory over the last number of years. That's indicative in key measures like our third grade reading proficiency that we see about 6 out of 10 third graders are not hitting our state standard for reading proficiency early on, which then really sets them up for a struggle going forward in the rest of their K-12 journey. And some of this decline is more pronounced and even greater for certain student subgroups, students from low-income backgrounds, students that are minority students, and those challenges in the classroom are also kind of compounded by some of mental health concerns coming out of the COVID pandemic, and as well as a really elevated and persistently high student absentee rate in the state of Michigan. Other states have been able to make some progress in reducing absenteeism. Michigan seems to be struggling there. In terms of funding hasn't been a major issue for schools, thanks in large part, as Bob talked about, to the sales tax, income tax growth, and the school aid fund. Just in January, we saw the improvements in school aid fund projections, so that's a good news story there. the roads funding plan with the changes to the sales tax held the school aid fund harmless from the impacts there. So school funding has kind of survived tax changes, the COVID challenges, and so funding, at least through the school aid fund, hasn't been a major issue for schools in Michigan in recent budgets, as well as there being large surpluses that have been spent down, and those are starting to dry up, but those have filtered into larger state allocations to K-12 schools. And then I'll just remind folks that the school aid fund funding for K-12 education is just one of a number of priorities and programs that the state has the responsibility to meet each year. And so we'll see how that competition and for budget resources is impacting K-12 schools going forward. So at a super high level, I just want to give you a big picture on the education budgets here. Overall, it's kind of a mixed bag. K-12 is seeing inflationary plus increases, both in some of the base funding components, but also some of the categorical or specific funding streams that the state sends to school districts. So inflation plus in those funding streams. For higher education, it's much different. This will be the second year in a row of flat funding for the state's community colleges and higher ed four-year colleges. On the K-12 front, the foundation allowance is going to see an inflationary increase next year. There's going to be continued emphasis on funding to support specific student groups and helping provide districts with additional resources to meet the expanded learning needs of certain student groups, low-income students, special ed students, students that are learning the English language. On the higher ed side, as I mentioned, flat funding. This will be the second year in a row that universities and community colleges are being held at the 2025 operation funding level. The state has provided discretionary increases in the current year's budget, and the governor's proposing a discretionary increase for next year, but those are one-time dollars that really aren't built into the base or current services baseline budgets for the public post-secondary institutions here. There is a large increase in the higher ed budget for our financial aid programs, specifically for the Michigan Achievement Scholarship, as well as an expansion of the Michigan Reconnect program. So there are some funding increases, but they aren't in the operations. And as we'll see, we're spending down the surpluses in the school aid fund. So I'm providing a chart to kind of show how the spend down of these surpluses has occurred, both in terms of the one-time resources that have been available to the school aid fund, but also ongoing school aid fund surpluses. The distinction here is the one-time resources are just that, one-time resources that are available. They're can be programmed into the budget, but they really shouldn't be put in for ongoing spending, things like the foundation allowance or funding for pension systems or any other ongoing resource or funding stream. Ongoing funding has been programmed in the budget, and that's why we've seen substantial increases in the base funding for schools. K-12 schools have seen under this governor, about a 30% increase in the foundation allowance over this time, but we're also seeing increases in student-specific funding, base funding over this period. So Under the budget that the governor's proposed, the surpluses will be completely exhausted at the end of 2027. So about $751 million that are being carried forward into the 27 budget year will be spent across one-time items and ongoing items in this budget. In addition to those surpluses that the school aid fund has held, the state has kind of squirreled away some of the school aid resources over the years into a series of reserve funds. I went back and looked. Since 2022, the state's kind of put away about $3.5 billion into a new school aid rainy day fund, a reserve fund to help schools with their infrastructure needs, a designated pot of funding, the only designated pot of funding for student transportation purposes, as well as a reserve fund for declining enrollment, basically to help districts that are seeing year over year student enrollment declines kind of meet the financial strain that comes with fewer per pupil dollars with the enrollment declines. So these reserve funds have been appropriated over several years, and you can see that the aggregate combined balances are slowly coming down. This budget would spend about $400 million alone. The two largest pieces in the budget are to provide the declining enrollment payments to districts and student transportation grants. I would note that if the proposal goes through, this would exhaust all of the reserve funds in those pots of money, basically leaving no designated funding for next year's budget. And those, again, are items that districts have been programming into their budgets for the last few years. Overall, the state will have about $1.1 billion remaining in these reserve funds. Again, those are separate from the school aid fund balance that will be exhausted. About $500 million of that is in a designated school aid rainy day fund. So if we get into the highlights of the budget proposal, again, the governor's recommending a general operation increase to the foundation allowance about 2.5%, raising the minimum foundation grant from just over $10,000 to $10,300. Cyber charters would receive 80% of this base foundation amounting to about $8,200. That affects about, I think, 110,000 students in the state of the 1.4 students. So it's not an insignificant piece. As I mentioned, the declining student enrollment, Michigan has seen its K-12 enrollment numbers on a 2-decade plus downward trajectory. Next year would be no different. There's an estimated 0.6% decline. I would note this is statewide enrollments are down 7% since 2019 when Governor Whitmer took office. Of course, with 800 and some school districts, experiences vary across the state, across traditional districts and charter schools. So this declining enrollment money gets spread across all types of districts, charters and locals, and to varying degrees based on the amount of enrollment decline they've experienced. There's additional money that has been put in the budget on one-time basis, but each year it has been reauthorized to meet student mental health needs. There's $300 million this year, again, for per pupil payments. About $50 million of that will be ongoing, so would carry into the 28 budget, but $300 million total for per pupil payments to help districts meet student mental health needs. I would note last year's budget included a condition on the receipt of these dollars that required districts to waive their information privilege as it related to state investigations around mass casualty events. There's a lawsuit involving this provision. That boilerplate language is tied to this funding again this year. So the case, the lawsuit hasn't been settled, and so the boilerplate language is continued into the 27 budget. And then last year was the third year of a universal school meals program, which had begun during the COVID pandemic. Again, this 27 budget will include $200 million for an expanded school meals program. As we look into the other components of the budget, I want to highlight some weighted student funding elements, basically identified funding streams for specific student groups. So several will get a 6% increase year over year. Notably, the economically disadvantaged student program for students that are deemed at risk of academic failure, there'll be a 7% increase, or I'm sorry, a 6% increase in the total funding. This will allow the state to provide weighted funding for students between 17 and 23% of the foundation allowance, ranging from about $1,700 per student to $2,300 based on the concentration of poverty in a district. Similar, there is a 6% increase in the English language learner funding. Again, this funding is converted to a weight, which is a function of the foundation allowance. The chart I've provided here on the right shows the growth of the foundation allowance over the last 7 years, with the governor's proposal for next year included. You can see the foundation allowance is up from about $7,900 to over $10,300 next year. That's about a 30% increase. But where funding has really seen growth has been in these weighted student funding elements, and here I'm showing the growth in the base level of at-risk funding. Per pupil allocation rose from about $700 in fiscal year 20, and it'll be under this proposal about $1,700. So that's more than doubling of that per pupil allocation. And there's a change in the budget I noted on the previous slide, where the Section 31A and the English language learner separate categoricals are being eliminated and folded into a new formula using a weighted student pupil count. And the way this will work is that there'll be a single funding stream to support the at-risk and English language student supports. And here the example I've provided is a district enrolls a low-income student that qualifies for a mid-level English supports. That pupil, because they've been identified in the state system as low income, will generate a weight of about 17%. That pupil, because they qualify for English language supports, will also qualify for about a 12% weight. Combined, those weights total almost 29%, and that 29% then is applied against the foundation allowance to drive the student-specific funding that this district would receive for that student. So in addition to the $10,300 foundation allowance, that student would also generate about $2,900 for a total of about $13,200 next year. This shift in how the funding's distributed is got some benefits for school districts in that it ties the funding directly to the foundation allowance, eliminates 2 of the larger categorical grants. This will provide districts with more spending discretion and reduce some of the state requirements with reporting and how the dollars are spent. Back in December, the governor convened an education summit where she identified early literacy as something she wanted to focus on. So we were waiting for this budget to see what would be included in there. There were media stories about a $600 million literacy initiative. We've been able to identify about $600 million in what I would say are both direct and indirect funding to address early literacy. Programs are of the one-time and ongoing variety, so dollars that would just be available for 2027, some that would be available in 27 and going forward. There's $100 million for high-impact tutoring, basically small group tutoring that districts would be able to access under this budget. About $100 million, $50 million to spend each of the next 2 years to implement effective curriculum around early literacy. The state's early literacy coalition, a commission has identified the curriculum that would meet this criteria, so districts would get money to purchase the curriculum that the state has kind of vetted. There's another $50 million to keep funding teacher training in the LETTERS program, the early literacy professional development teacher training program. So this $50 million would be available for the next 5 years for districts to send teachers to get the upskilling they need to help struggling readers learn how to master the English language and literacy. The indirect funding items that the governor's included in her $600 million initiative includes an expansion of the Great Start Readiness Program. This would include a bump in the per pupil allocation here, as well as some additional slots. The funding that's being identified in the governor's budget would meet what is expected to be the demand for the free preschool program that's run by the state, Great Start Readiness. There's also an additional $135 million before after school summer programs, which obviously do more than just expose children to early literacy, but this has been part of the $600 million initiative that the governor is put forward here. So let me quickly, I'll skip over this one. Let me quickly get to the post-secondary funding highlights here in this proposal. Again, flat funding for community college university operations. However, there is an increase in the school aid allocation in the higher ed budgets. And again, as Bob mentioned, this is primarily to address the general fund budget concerns. For 2027, there's no increase in the base funding for community colleges, universities, but there's a continuation. It would be the second year in a row of a one-time discretionary funding component equal to about 3% of their base operations funding. So the bottom line is this is the second year in a row that our post-secondary schools are going to be relying on their 2025 operations funding level. The governor's proposing, both for community colleges and universities, some one-time dollars to be spent in infrastructure, technology, safety improvements on campuses. Those dollars would get distributed to the institutions based on their share of the total operations funding. So it's kind of a equal across the board funding increase, but again, a one-time bump. There are large increases in the financial aid scholarship programs at the state funds. An additional cohort of students will be be made available for the Michigan Achievement Scholarship. That's going to drive the cost of that program statewide up by $232 million. Expanding the Michigan Reconnect program from 25-year-olds down to 21-year-olds is going to increase the cost of that program from about $25 million. And then there's a fund shift within the how the scholarships are paid for, removing the general fund dollars and replacing those with school aid fund dollars. That's about a $198 million fund shift. All told, the school aid fund will be picking up about $1.8 billion of the costs in the community college higher ed budget next year. That's up from $1.3 billion this year. Just breaking that increase out into the components, about $200 million is just a dollar for dollar fund shift, and then there's another $200 million in increases in school aid or in appropriation for scholarships, and all of those are being funded out of the 200 out of the school aid fund. And I would just note that the general fund did hold the school aid fund harmless in the roads packages last year. Bob mentioned this. This is one of the reasons why there's less general fund dollars to go around. And for the 2027 year, that amounts to about $600 million. So that kind of covers the highlights in the education budget. And Bob's going to then bring us home and look at what the long-term outlook of the budget is.
Thank you, Craig. So we will wrap up now as we typically do, kind of looking, all right, what does this all mean looking ahead to the budget that will be introduced in a year for fiscal year 2028. And we're going to see slightly different numbers, but really the same story. On the general fund side, this kind of replicates the chart we did earlier. Again, the revenue estimates on the beige solid line show the correct estimates adjusted for the various tax policy proposals that have both been enacted and also proposed by the governor. And then we take in on the dotted red line what the governor's fiscal year 27 ongoing general fund proposal is, plus something we definitely know is coming, which is very likely a $300 million increase in SNAP, which is federal food assistance benefit costs, that will be coming in fiscal year 28 on top of the ongoing fiscal year 27 appropriations. Once we look at, remember, revenue does rebound in fiscal year 28 on the general fund side, but not enough to meet these ongoing costs. It'll be a very small gap, but there's still about a $56 million shortfall between revenue and those ongoing costs. So again, we start the fiscal year underwater in fiscal year 28 as well as we did this year. And again, this is just the ongoing general fund appropriations that the governor has recommended, plus these known SNAP benefit costs. It doesn't factor in yet Medicaid cost increases, other public assistance, caseload cost increases, state payroll cost increases that are probably coming to some degree. I would note that the House Fiscal Agency gave an excellent presentation to the House Appropriations Committee last week. They tried to estimate all of those other cost pressures, and they believe that on top of the 56 that we show here, when you factor in caseloads, employee payroll, and other cost pressures, that the gap becomes about $475 million on their balance sheets, based on their estimates of those caseload factors and what they thought employee payroll and other costs might be. So the general fund stays in a pretty sizable hole next year, where in order to, you're going to need to raise new revenue or cut to afford just the basic inflationary adjustments that go along with keeping the budget whole. On the school aid fund side, again, all is well, at least as I said for now. Like this year, when we look at ongoing school aid fund appropriations carrying forward into fiscal year 28, relative, and the red dotted line relative to the revenue in the beige line, we still have a surplus. A tiny bit smaller, but $532 million, 2.7% growth and ongoing appropriations would be available with the revenue. I think, again, the key question, the general fund is in trouble. The school aid fund has this surplus for K-12 groups and others. They'll be interested. Are all lawmakers going to be tempted to do some of the same cost shifting that was part of this budget in the fiscal year 28 budget as well? As Craig noted, and we just do a big picture look as we conclude, we're moving into a different era now with the budgeting, much tighter budgets, and both on the general fund side and the school aid fund side, under the budget, under the governor's proposal, we would leave fiscal year 27, and under all the assumptions we're currently making about general fund and school aid fund costs in revenues, we would leave 27 with only $20 million in general fund budget balance and $2 million in school aid fund budget balance. And you'll note that is $12 billion less than where we were at in terms of the combined fund balances about 5 years back in fiscal year 2022. So that wraps up our budget webinar. Again, just the general fund will continue to face some cost stresses. I should even note before we wrap up, I guess, that those will continue. We talked about SNAP cost pressures and that'll start hitting on the 27 budget. As we get to 28, 29, 30, there will be other cost pressures related to our hospital provider tax, potentially some additional costs there as well. So the general fund will probably continue to be under some strain in the coming years. Again, the outlook is a little better for the school aid fund. So we will end there. We are pleased to have our friends from MERS with us. Kamal is here, and I don't know if John Rurink has made it onto the podcast yet, but Kyle, we will turn it over to you for questions and answers. And again, thank you everyone for attending. John, take it, Kyle, take it away.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Actually, John is on, and I think he's going to lead off with the first question.
John, can you unmute? And this doesn't seem to be working as it should. Kyle, maybe you can go ahead while we try to troubleshoot this.
Sure. Yeah, I had the first question I had isn't necessarily about the current budget or the budget proposal, but we have several gubernatorial candidates talking about eliminating the income tax. Could you guys address what that would do to the state budget? And first of all, I guess I want to ask, is that even feasible to eliminate the income tax as a source of revenue?
Well, I suppose anything is technically feasible, but the income tax is our largest tax revenue source. We generate a little more than $14 billion from the income tax. I think a little more than it's the largest contributor to the general fund. I think it's a little more than $9 billion hits our general fund. That's probably two-thirds, 65% of the general fund. Just thinking off the top of my head. More than $4 billion to the school aid fund, and that's sizable, probably 25% of the school aid fund. so if you get rid of the income tax, you face those holes that you need to either massively cut the budget in ways that would be extremely challenging. 2/3 of the general fund and 25% of the dual aid fund maybe, or find new revenue to replace it. And I don't know. It would be hard to replace that amount of revenue. The entire sales tax is $9 to $10 billion. So if you'd have to double the sales tax to get another $9 or $10 billion out of the sales tax, just as an example. I hate to call anything infeasible, but it would be extremely hard, and you would have to completely, the state budget would look just entirely different than it does today. And on the general fund side, again, 3/4 Medicaid and child welfare, DHHS, universities, and corrections. Extent that you hit general fund, you could eliminate all the other departments, and it's probably $3.5 billion, in general fund designations there. So hopefully that addresses it, Kyle. Feasible, I guess, but you're going to be either doing some massive budget rewriting or having to draw in immense amounts of revenue to replace the income tax.
All right, thank you. The next question we have, the presentation noted that 41% of our budget comes from federal funds. Given the volatility in the federal policy, how exposed is Michigan structurally to federal fiscal risk compared to our peer states? And is our reliance on the federal revenue unusually high, average, or conservative?
I think I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest, Kyle. I don't know if I've looked at it. I would assume we might be so I think Michigan, one thing that Michigan has done over the decades, and that now has given us some risk, is our Medicaid financing, our reliance on Medicaid provider taxes as a fund source, hospitals, nursing homes, the insurance provider assessment. Those are all designed to leverage federal funds and to bring as much federal revenue to the state as we can, to enhance reimbursement to those providers to some extent, but also to just help with our general fund costs and Medicaid. So in that sense, we might be a little more exposed. And HR1 has shown us, because the federal government is now facing, we know the federal deficits and the national debt is just enormous. And we really are, I think, approaching a crisis stage that I don't know if it's going to happen in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but there is going to be a day of reckoning at some point where the federal government's going to need to look at getting its fiscal house in order. And certainly, just as we saw in HR1, a piece of that is going to be getting tougher on states in terms of the share of federal revenue that's going to programs like whether it's Medicaid or any major education. Those funds may get more scarce, somewhere down the road.
Yeah. All right, Bob, next question. Is the current fiscal year budget for the state of Michigan bigger than last year's?
Is the current budget bigger than last year's?
Yes, the current fiscal year 26
budget bigger than 25. I think where we landed is it's minusculely bigger because of the supplementals that were added to the. No, I'm sorry. You got to give me a second to think, Kyle. I think it's minusculely smaller, if I'm remembering our analysis. The budget enacted last October is definitely bigger than the budget enacted the prior year in 25. But then we put a bunch of money into the 25 budget through a supplemental, and when you add that in, they're about the same size. And 26 was actually a tiny bit smaller. But I think with the shifting back of this Medicaid provider tax revenue, you have at least a little bit of better apples to apples comparison of the budget. So yeah, it was about the same size and maybe just a tiny bit smaller.
Thank you. Immediately following the budget proposal, the speaker rejected the governor's proposed tax increases for this budget and instead called for cutting for waste, fraud, and abuse, and that he has already saved Medicaid. Is there waste, fraud, and abuse in this governor's proposal? And has the state saved Medicaid, as the speaker has claimed?
Well, the state is, I would assume the speaker might be referring to the fixes that were done in the last budget with, they have saved the insurance provider assessment, which had we had to eliminate that tax, we would have had a very large hole in Medicaid. And the bipartisan agreement that mapped out a roadmap to adjust that tax, as we will need to do by the beginning of next year, I believe it is, next calendar year, will save us a lot of money in Medicaid. I think that probably $500,000 plus the, $1.5 billion, maybe a little bit more than that in lost Medicaid support would have occurred without that fix. So that helped save the immediate problem for Medicaid. There are more problems, well, more challenges at least, coming down the pike. Our hospital provider tax will begin to, under HR 1, will have to be scaled back. We really probably won't see serious impacts from that until a little bit maybe in 28, but probably more so in fiscal year 2029. So those challenges are still coming, and the state will have to reckon with those as those begin to show up in the budget, again, either by enduring cuts to hospital and Medicaid reimbursement in general, or finding new revenue to fill those holes as well.
Bob, is it fair to say that waste, fraud, and abuse is a subjective term?
I think it's very fair to say that, yes. I mean, if you don't think that it is any program, the store fund, is that waste, or is because, boy, it's a bad way to spend incentive dollars, or is that great economic development initiative that draws new business and jobs into Michigan? That's completely subjective. I think there's evidence and data that can help, for some programs can help show impact, or show the lack of impact. But for most, LARA regulatory programs, do we need those or not? I think that's going to totally depend on your perspective of how important, any particular regulatory activity is. So yes, Craig, Kyle, I would agree with that.
All right, Craig, I got a question on the school aid budget and the use of school aid fund dollars to fund universities and colleges. Obviously, the governor had said when she ran for office 8 years ago that she wanted to end the use of general fund dollar or school aid fund dollars to fund colleges and universities. Instead, it sounds like we're getting more of it than we've ever had before. How difficult is it, or would it be, to wean off universities and colleges from that school aid funding stream?
Well, good question, Kyle. Yeah, you got the history about right. We've seen a growth in the use of those school aid dollars in higher education. the why behind that is probably a complicated answer, but it involves the fact that for a good portion of the time that we've been looking at the budget here, the general fund has been kind of holding, barely holding its head above water. And as Bob pointed out, it's actually going to show some year-over-year declines. And so that those pressures kind of have to be relieved somewhere. And some of it happens in adjustments to the budget, but some of the pressures relieved by kind of dipping into the school aid fund for higher education. We now have 100% of the community college budget, north of $500 million, is supported out of the school aid budget, and roughly $800 million this current year. It'll go up to about 1.3 billion under this budget is supporting the higher ed budget, both the operations funding as well as funding for the marquee student financial aid programs, the Michigan Achievement Scholarship and the Reconnect. So finding $1.8 billion in the span of one budget year, outside of raising taxes or raising something to put more resources into the general fund, doesn't seem super possible right now, and at all very likely. So I think the school aid fund has become part of the fabric of the funding for higher education, both on the operations side and the student financial scholarships and financial aid side of post-secondary budgets in the state.
Bob, how constrained is Michigan's general fund compared to prior decades? I mean, is this kind of an historical situation we're seeing, or is this kind of a cyclical thing?
I think much of the decline in, as we talked about early in the webinar, much of the revenue decline that we're seeing is tied to our own decision making on the roads. The legislature last October decided to prioritize the roads, and in doing that, shifted a significant amount of general fund revenue over to road construction and maintenance purposes. So we've sort of, it's much more than cyclical or economic. It's that tax policy decision. We certainly had a much greater challenge for a much more prolonged period in the early 2000s. I mean, 2001 through all the way through the Great Recession, we lost significant general fund revenue, somewhat tied to tax policy decisions, but a lot of it tied to lost employment, lost income, which then of course rippled into our tax revenues. And that, I don't think our situation right now compares to that one. That would, that's the historic abyss for Michigan's budget, I suppose, on the general fund side. This is a prolonged period though, where we'll have, from 2025 to 2028, we'll just be coming out of that hole 3 years later with general fund. But again, kind of a self-made a problem or challenge, and you can't say it's the wrong one. If the roads are the priority, then the road should be the priority, and you move the money over there. You will need to reckon with that at some point. And so far, I guess this budget hasn't completely done that. We probably we're facing, once we add in inflationary costs like caseloads, $400 or $500 million in the hole in fiscal year 28, and we've already tapped $400 million in budget stabilization fund to sort of push that off for one more year, frankly. So
Okay. Craig, I got another question in regards to the governor's proposal on at-risk and English learners and transportation funding. How significant is the change here? It sounds like she'd like to kind of tie this into a particular formula. Tell us how significant this is and what the political realities are of trying to get this accomplished.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a distinction without a difference when it comes down to the funding. It's the amount of funding. The state has been, as my chart on I forget what slide it was number, but I had shown that the state has been directing larger sums of dollars into kind of these student-specific funding streams, so at-risk and English language learners. And so that trend is continuing next year under this budget. The governor provides a 6% increase in those funding streams, as contrasted with just a 2.5% increase in the base foundation. This is kind of the stage 2, I guess, if you were, or phase 2 of the Proposal A reforms from back in the mid-90s. If you recall, the intent in Proposal A was to kind of get all districts at the same base funding level, and Michigan achieved that in 2022. All districts are now receiving the same minimum foundation allowance, and with that kind of success, the state legislators, the governor has kind of pivoted and have focused on what might be considered more equitable funding that's directed to specific student groups to help meet their needs, acknowledging that not all kids start out their K-12 journey at the same starting point, right? So the funding is going to continue to flow to districts to meet those students' needs. So if you're a district, a high poverty district, you're going to get more per pupil dollars because those students have greater needs. And that's why I call it kind of the phase 2 of the Proposal A reforms. The changes that are being proposed in this budget are probably, at least from a K-12 budget officer's perspective, probably welcome, because these additional resources are going to come with a little less, a little fewer state strings attached. Will provide the ability for districts. They'll still have to spend the money to serve these students. Let me be very clear there. But they won't have to jump through the state hoops that are currently tied to these dollars under this new funding formula.
I think we got time for one more question. And Bob, I want to ask you about these proposed tax increases: the tobacco, the vape, the internet, the per wager sports betting, digital advertising. Do any of these proposals cast the state outside the norm? I mean, are these tax increases, would they make us an outlier compared to other states if we actually adopted them?
Bob, you're muted.
Sorry, Kyle. I muted myself and didn't unmute. I don't think we haven't engaged in a state-by-state analysis or anything yet, but based on some of the information provided in some of the supporting documentation, I don't think we would be an extreme outlier with the tobacco stuff. I don't know much about how many states have vape taxes. I would be surprised if it's if it's really rare, given the health issues that of beginning to learn more about with vaping. Certainly casinos. There are states that tax them more and less than us. The digital advertising tax, which we heard about a little bit last year, in some of the early road funding discussions. I don't know how unusual or unique that is yet. So I'm probably ignorant on that one. But I think we would, I don't think we would be extreme outliers on the other stuff.
All right, thank you. All right, Eric, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Carl, and thanks for pinch hitting when we couldn't get John unmuted. So thank you all for attending. This is a pretty long session, but we covered a lot of ground, and hopefully we answered your questions. If not, you can find our emails on our website at crcmich.org and shoot them over, and we'll try to provide any information that we missed. We recorded this session, and it takes an hour or so for everything to process and us to get it on the website, but we'll get that done this afternoon, and you'll be able to find it linked on the webinar page where we had registration open for this. Thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of the day. Try to stay warm.